Sources of history: primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Imagine someone tells you that a great African kingdom existed over 1,000 years ago. How would you know if that story is true? Would you simply believe it because someone said so? Or would you ask for evidence? History is not built on guesses. It is built on evidence. But where does that evidence come from? Welcome back to Afrocentric view of history. In our last episode, we learned what history is and why it matters. Today, we'll answer another important question. What are the types of sources of history, and how do historians use them? What are sources of history? A source of history is anything that provides information about the past. Sources help historians reconstruct events, understand societies, and learn how people lived. Think of history as solving a giant puzzle. Every source is a puzzle piece. One piece alone may not tell the whole story, but together they create a clearer picture of the past. Historians do not rely on just one source. They compare different kinds of sources to separate fact from opinion and to build a more accurate understanding of history. The three main types of historical sources are primary sources, secondary sources, tertiary sources. Each one plays an important role in historical study. 1. Primary sources. A primary source is an original source created during the time being studied or by someone who directly experienced the event. Primary sources give us direct evidence from the past. They are often the closest thing historians have to eyewitness testimony. Examples of primary sources: letters and diaries, official documents and government records, royal inscriptions and ancient manuscripts, photographs and recordings, speeches and interviews, artifacts such as tools, pottery, coins, weapons, and jewelry, eyewitness accounts, archaeological remains, maps made during the historical period. Why primary sources matter? Primary sources are valuable because they provide direct access to the past. They allow historians to study events, people, and societies using original evidence. For example, ancient manuscripts from places such as Timbuktu can reveal knowledge about science, law, mathematics, astronomy, literature, and religion. These are primary sources because they come from the historical period itself. Likewise, archaeological discoveries such as pottery, burial sites, and ancient architecture are primary sources because they are physical remains from the past. However, primary sources must still be studied carefully. They may reflect the bias, perspective, or purpose of the person who created them. 2. Secondary sources. A secondary source is a source created later by someone who did not directly witness the event but studied primary sources and interpreted them. Secondary sources explain, analyze, or discuss the past. Examples of secondary sources: history textbooks, scholarly articles, documentaries, biographies, historical essays, research books written by historians, classroom lectures based on historical research. Why secondary sources matter? Secondary sources help us understand historical events more clearly. They bring together information from many primary sources and present it in a way that is easier to study. For example, a historian writing about the Mali Empire may use royal records, oral traditions, archaeological findings, and manuscripts as primary sources. The historian's book about Mali would then be a secondary source. Secondary sources are useful because they provide interpretation, context, and analysis. But historians must still check whether the writer used reliable evidence and whether the interpretation is fair. 3. Tertiary sources. A tertiary source is a source that summarizes or compiles information from primary and secondary sources. Tertiary sources are usually used for quick reference, general overview, or basic background information. Examples of tertiary sources: encyclopedias, dictionaries, almanacs, fact books, timelines, bibliographies, indexes, some textbooks and reference guides. Why tertiary sources matter? Tertiary sources are helpful when you want a broad introduction to a topic. They can guide you toward more detailed primary and secondary sources. For example, if you want a quick summary of ancient Egyptian history, an encyclopedia entry may give you a useful overview. But if you want deeper understanding, you would need to study primary evidence and scholarly secondary works. Tertiary sources are not usually the final authority on a topic, but they are useful starting points for research. Why evidence matters. History is strongest when multiple sources support the same conclusion. A single story, document, or artifact rarely tells the complete picture. Good historians compare evidence, ask difficult questions, and remain willing to revise conclusions when new discoveries emerge. This approach helps history become more accurate over time. It also teaches us not to accept every claim without checking the evidence. Afrocentric perspective. From an Afrocentric perspective, every source deserves careful consideration. For many years, African oral traditions and local knowledge systems were often dismissed, while written accounts from outsiders were treated as the only reliable evidence. Modern historians increasingly recognize that African history must be studied using all available sources, primary, secondary, and tertiary. Archaeology, oral traditions, manuscripts, inscriptions, linguistics, and scholarly research all contribute valuable information. When these sources are examined together, they provide a richer and more balanced understanding of Africa's past. The goal is not to accept every claim uncritically, but to evaluate all evidence carefully and fairly. In conclusion, today we've learned that history is built on evidence, not assumptions. We also learned the three main types of sources of history. Primary sources, original evidence from the time being studied. Secondary sources, later interpretations based on primary sources. Tertiary sources, summaries and reference materials that compile information from other sources. By comparing these sources, historians can reconstruct events with greater confidence. In our next episode, we'll explore another fascinating question. Who is a historian, and what exactly does a historian do? If you enjoyed this lesson, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who are passionate about history. Thank you for watching Afrocentric View of History.